Good afternoon. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Marcia Castro. I'm the Endelot Professor of Demography and also Chair of the Department of Global Health and Population at the School of Public Health. Most importantly, I am very proud to serve as the Director of the Brazil Studies Program here in the David Rockefeller Center for Latin America Studies. We're very excited to have all you here today for the inaugural Haddad Distinguished Lecture. The lecture will be delivered by Dr. Arminio Fraga, and in a moment, I'm going to properly introduce our speaker. But before we go to the lecture, I want to introduce a very esteemed colleague and friend from Hagopian, who is going to say a few words about the person that we're really honoring today. Professor Hagopian is the Jorge Paulo Lemann Senior Lecturer on Government. She's the former director of the Brazil Studies Program, and I am very proud that I had the chance to work with her, learn from her, and really, Fran is the person that built all the foundation for the Brazil Studies Program that we have now. So I just follow the lead, and now it's very easy for me to be the chair of the Brazil Studies Program. So Fran, come here and say a few words.
That was incredibly generous and kind, Marcia. Thank you. Claudio, Rosalie, and Arminio, and colleagues and students. I want to add my words of welcome to Marcia's. And I want to say we're especially gratified for the students, the colleagues who've turned out at a time of year that we are all completely exhausted. But we're here for a very good reason. We're here to celebrate. Today's a day for the Brazil Studies Program to celebrate. We've spent some time building this program. As Marcia said, we're really proud of it. We're here today also to celebrate the person who deserves as much credit as anyone for what this program has become, Claudio Haddad. In his role as chair of the advisory committee, the advisory group of our office, of our Brazil office in São Paulo, Claudio helped to open that office in 2006. He helped to recruit as impressive and distinguished a group that could help to guide our decisions, to give us valuable advice and support from different regional, professional and personal perspectives. And I want to say, if I remember my old committee reports right, that Arminio, you were a member of the advisory group in its early days. So I feel like we've come full circle today for that reason. With Claudio, with his family, personally supported our office in São Paulo when the US dollar was weak. And knowing something about universities, he basically paid the light bill. He basically kept the office going. And through the years, he supported our program in Cambridge as well. Though he holds a Ph.D. in economics from the University of Chicago, I don't hold that against you guys. He has become a leader of the international efforts of this university as recognized by his membership on the President's International Advancement Council. He also holds an advanced business degree from the Harvard Business School, which he has also generously supported. But most important for our assembly here today, Claudio has personally made resources possible for academic research on this side of the river. Some of it policy relevant, some of it not. A grandson of Lebanese immigrants whose own father had to drop out of school at a young age to support his family after his father died, Claudio has supported dozens of students at this university, at various faculties of the university, some of them who are first and second generation college. He supported directly, others he supported indirectly but critically through supporting their research, making it possible for them to travel to Brazil, to collect original data, and in the process, to often train Brazilian students. I can attest that his investment in our students has paid off handsomely. Some of them have won major disciplinary prizes published in top journals, And they will be training the next generation of PhDs who will be, and professional and holders of professional master's programs who will be working in Brazil. What is unique about Claudio is that he always, however, trusted us to know what we needed. But he was always there to give advice when I asked for it, sometimes when I didn't, but mostly when I asked for it. He understood from the beginning the importance of investing in students and research, but he also kept us, and I want to say kept me focused on how we could also make an impact in Brazil, whether in early childhood development or in cities or in other projects. Note that he did this while he was building his own university in Brazil, Insper, which in the time that I have known him, I remember my first tour, Claudio, when you were adding the engineering building, this school has flourished to the point that is now spoken in the same breath with the Fundação Getulio Vargas as the two private schools that are the exception to the public schools that are the best in Brazil. And I want to say that I'm personally grateful to you and to Rosalie for always opening your home to me every time I came to São Paulo. We were a bit of an odd couple, you and me, but I like to think we built something. And it was a unique privilege always for me to work with Claudio. And I remember one of the great moments of satisfaction in my life was when he said to a group of his peers in Brazil one day, who he took me to introduce me to. And he said, I never could have imagined the difference that an American university could make in Brazil. And I want to say to you today, Claudio, I could never have imagined the difference that one visionary, generous Brazilian economist would have made to this university and to putting Brazil studies on the map at this university. And we are the envy of Brazil studies. We're the envy of international programs at this school, and we are the envy of Brazil studies programs across the country. That's thanks to you.
Thank you.
And the last thing I want to say to get to the business of today is that one of the promises I made Claudio and the board when I was constantly asked what my goals were, you see, I didn't go to business school, so I didn't know this was going to be the question that was always going to be asked, was what were my goals for this program? And I said, well, of course, to be the best Brazil studies program outside of Brazil in the world. But I also said that I wanted this to be a place where there would be, that Harvard to be an essential crossroads of that where people would come to have serious conversations about Brazil and about the challenges facing Brazil. And so several years ago, we got the idea of developing the idea of this lecture series to honor Claudio's massive contributions to Harvard, and to do so by bringing a distinguished Brazilian speaker every year who would speak to some of the major challenges facing Brazil. Our inaugural speaker, Arminio Fraga, we are thrilled you are here. I know it's because of Claudio and not because of us, but we're thrilled anyway. Marcia will introduce him in a moment. But I want to say that we arranged this lecture 3 years ago. Something called the COVID-19 pandemic got in the way. And I'm just so happy that today we are inaugurating this lecture series. Some of us won't be here forever, but we hope that the Haddad Distinguished Lecture series will be. So thank you.
Thank you, Fran. So as Fran just said, we really couldn't think of anyone other than you, Arminio, to be the inaugural speaker for this lecture. You had a long bio in the announcement. I'll just say a few words. So Arminio is the founding partner at Gávea Investimentos in Rio. Recently, and that's the most important thing, in 2019, he founded the Institute for Health Policy Studies, an independent, non-partisan think-to-do tank. And it's called, we call it the acronym YEPS. It has been a very important voice. It was an extremely important voice before the elections. The work that the team that Arminio put together had an incredible voice in thinking how we could improve the health system in Brazil and the health conditions in Brazil, and they continue to do so. And I know that it was a very brave move to study health, and I hope you never give up studying health because you're really making a huge difference. Dr. Fraga has held many different leadership appointments. I'm not going to list all of them. I'm just going to mention that he was the president of the central bank in Brazil from 1999 to 2002, and before he was also the director responsible for international affairs in the central bank. Dr. Fraga is an economist. He has a PhD from Princeton. We're both Tigers. We share that. He has published widely in areas of international finance, macroeconomics, and monetary policy. He also has taught at the Catholic University in Rio, the Grad School of Economics at Getulio Vargas Foundation, the School of International Affairs at Columbia University, and the Wharton School at UPenn. And today we have him here with us, and he's gonna tell us why we don't learn. And hopefully after the lecture, we all have learned something. So Arminio, please.
Ok.
Você vai andar?
Não. Okay. Well, we're finally here. Thank you. I am delighted, honored, in many ways humbled by having been chosen. I'm not an academic. To come here, to come to Harvard, makes me want to ask questions and not to provide too many answers, but I hope that I can, in a way, be provocative enough to make some of you come up with the answers. But before that, I'd like to say a little bit about my relationship with Claudio, who I've first met, and we talked a little bit about this over lunch yesterday when I was in high school. And at that time, I thought I was going to be a doctor. I come from a family of doctors that worked at the Federal University in Rio, where Claudio's father was also a professor. And I woke up one day and I said, no, I don't have it in me to be a doctor. I need to find something else to do. And I went over and talked to an uncle of mine who at the time was the president of the university. And Claudio's father was, I guess, the vice president. And he talked to me, he figured that I was kind of in need of help. And he said, maybe you should meet the son of Shafi Haddad, who just came back from doing a PhD in economics. And so Claudio's father arranged for the meeting. I attended, and anyway, the rest is history. I kind of liked what I heard, although I can't quite say exactly what it was that he told me, but he did so in his inimitable way. And then beyond that, we ended up, spending and interacting quite frequently, including my first job out of grad school. And there I saw in Claudio something I was looking for. Because in a way, my family had it in the field of medicine, and it ended up being, very inspiring to see someone who had done academic work in very important fashion. Again, I'm talking about Claudio here, not me. But someone who was very successful in business, in government. He revolutionized the open market operations of the Brazilian Central Bank at a time where this was badly needed. And then who perhaps, one of his many, but perhaps his main legacy, the Insper, not-for-profit private university. So I'm very, very pleased, Claudio, and I myself try to follow in a way, and to me to see the things that you were doing all throughout, our lives has made a big difference. So, speaking of that, the subject I have chosen is work in progress. I've been working on it for 40 years. And it has to do with this very disturbing run we've had. And I'll show you some numbers. And I'm going to start with, I think, is perhaps the most positive part, which is a slight reinterpretation of the data for these 7 years or so. And then I'll go on to talk about the stuff that we haven't been able to do. So I'm calling this the proximate causes of our underperformance. And those are kind of basic, education, macroeconomic stability, etc. And then I start walking into much more difficult territory in discussing the deeper causes. And I'm deeply in trouble by the time I get to that part. And then I finish with, do we have any answers? And I'll save that for the end. So here's what I want to show you for starters. Oh, what I'm doing here has to do with what I put there, but we don't need to waste too much time. But I fit that phrase. This was something Bob Lucas from Chicago said. This is sort of in honor of Claudio. Once we start thinking about growth, it's hard to think about anything else. I am very much like that. I mean, I'm obsessed with economic development. But then also with somebody from Harvard, that being Amartya Sen. This applies to Brazil in spades, which is basically Brazil is an amazingly unequal country. And that is also something, we need to do something about. And I've over the years, have become more and more convinced that these two objectives, particularly in our case, I'm not saying this is a mathematical theorem, but I'm totally convinced that in our case, if we don't work on the productivity front on the one end and on the inequality front, we have no chance. Okay, we have here the daughter of former President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who's, I think the main name that comes to mind. There are others, but when we do this kind of stuff. So those are my points. I'm going to skip. First chart. I think this tells it. This is the ratio of Brazil's income or GDP per capita and the US's year by year. This is World Bank data. And for some reason, they didn't have my first 10 years here, but they're pretty much going up. These 30 years were years of very fast growth. I'll show you a little bit more in a second. But then, boom, look at this. I mean, I think I can point. Look at this. We got to, say, 20 or a quarter. It depends on where you anchor it. And this is one hell of a collapse. I'm of the view that a country like Brazil, where most things are so-so, should have a lot of room to grow faster than the mature economies. We can imitate what they do well. We can build up on our human capital base. We can build up on old-fashioned capital. We can do so many things. But there you have it. And then we went up again, and boom, another one. So this is kind of my little story for this afternoon. Is why? What are we doing, really? So this one I'm going to skip quickly, but this is just a chart of growth by, these are the political terms. So it's Cardoso, Lula, Dilma, Temer, Bolsonaro. Sorry. And you can see that we had one major collapse in there, but if you look at Brazil on the far right, we've been growing a lot less for a long time. And those are the other emerging markets, okay? So that's that. Now here's the data that is often mentioned. And it has to do with the growth. Brazil used to grow at 7% a year. That's what everybody says. And then the collapse, 7 to 2%. Now, I want to do a little bit of, I want to play with these numbers a little bit to show you in this introductory part that perhaps we're not talking about a 5 percentage points difference, but a little bit less. So 5 meaning 7 minus 2, this is 5.2% drop in growth. Now, one thing that we should keep in mind is that what really matters in the end is the growth per person. And if population was growing very fast, perhaps we ought to look at the income per capita rather than the overall income of the country. If our population was growing at 3% at the time, and it is now soon going to be growing at 0, so if we do 4% now, it's kind of the same. Okay, so that's one point. So here is the per capita. And the per capita shows that the gap is not quite so big. The second adjustment I want to make is where you cut the time interval. Okay? The one that is usually used takes us to 1980, which was the peak of this growth era. Shortly after that, we totally collapsed. Now, I propose to you that we should include the so-called lost decade that followed in the accounting of the initial period. So I think the best way, or the better way at least, is to do that. And this is what we have. And if you do so, and I think this is true because, and I'll try to argue my point in the next session, it had to do with a lot of flaws in the development model that we, for better or worse, chose or end up adopting. And I'll talk about that in a second. But so now we are down to 3 points, if you do it this way. And then if you do the per capita adjustment, this is what you end up. So this is GDP per capita and my time slice. And now we're down, say it goes from 3 to 1.6. Okay. It shouldn't be that hard, quite frankly, to deliver that much growth. So lastly, as far as these basic facts are concerned, I have a little something here on inequality. And you could pick all kinds of measures. I have on the left Gini coefficient that shows that our distribution of income has improved. This is very important. Poverty rates have come down, but we're still very unequal. We have just below us Chile, that is a little better, and then some other cases. And over there, another set of measures, top 1%, 11.8, etc. But we don't need much more. This is pretty much a well-known. Now, the next part is basically a description of why we failed, in my view, and let's go take a look. So first, the fast growth era, it's a slight exaggeration, but it's thought to be the easier phase in growth. There was a lot of urbanization, industrialization, and all of that was okay, nothing wrong with that. I'm here speaking in the presence of Ed Glazer. When one talks about urbanization, we know there are a lot of benefits that come with it is often challenging, but it's a good thing. But there were a lot of very important shortcomings, and you can compare it with Asia, for instance, Asian countries, and it jumps at you. First of all, Brazil opted for a model of import substitution. It was kind of a infant industry protection, but it is now kind of ridiculous to say that when we think of the auto industry in Brazil. It cannot be an infant industry of 60 years or more, 80 years. But we never took the wheels off, and our bicycle never really moved very fast. A second point has to do with education and indirectly with inequality. It really was not a major objective. During the military years, same thing. And, well, this is probably the most important flaw. Then one could argue, and at one point you had massive presence of the state not in the regulatory aspects of an economy, but actually involved in telecommunications, in steel, in mining, in banking, in fertilizers, and on and on and on. It's probably over half of the economy. It wasn't working too well. The fourth point is, I think, possibly one of the key ones, and it's still with us. And I'm going to get back to this more than once. I think this is a key issue. And lastly, it's been a wild ride on the macroeconomic front. It's very difficult to grow if every 10 years you blow up. It not only the blowing up is painful, but the expectation that you're going to keep blowing up is very damaging. You know, it's an element or creates an element of risk that is totally unnecessary. Not surprisingly, this model started to fail. It was happening, not surprisingly, towards the end of the military rule. They started losing, whatever support they had, if any, and finally Brazil blew up. We were spiraling up towards hyperinflation. We defaulted on our debt in 1982, but the bicycle just wouldn't move any faster. And if you try to make it move too fast, you then start seeing it's textbook. Balance of payments problems, inflation problems, classic, totally textbook. So that's why I think we should include what came next. Now, it's interesting that it took us so long to move out of that. That's another story, but that's a fact. Now, a couple charts to give you examples of what I mean when I highlight these problems. Here on the left, you have folks with a graduate degree. Brazil is way down there. I actually was very surprised with Argentina. I thought they were a little better, but anyway, it's very low. There are other indicators one can use. I have, after the end of my talk, I still have some extra slides, but I don't think you need to look them. PISA scores and so on. The one on the right is a comparison with Korea, and we lagged. Maybe we're catching up a bit, but the problem is the following. We have more years of schooling, though not enough, but we have a serious problem with quality. And that I didn't want to impose on you one chart after the other. The macro stuff is interesting, and I have just a simple chart of GDP growth, and you could do things with these numbers. I actually have done them, but I didn't think it would fit my time here today. But you can see the following. You see the zero line, and here we're not doing per capita. The zero line, we had a nice run, we come down every now and then here all of a sudden you're going deep inside the line. 38% of the time during this the full period that includes the part that I'm debiting the old regime, I think 38% of the time Brazil grew less, was in negative per capita growth. Less than half was the case of the US. So this is it. It's a wild ride. Now, since then, by the time we got around to 1983-4, we had, I don't know, half a dozen failed stabilization efforts, some crazy plans, typically very incomplete. And we were still in default up until the early 90s. And it took us a while, but then in the 90s, things started to change. And I think a lot of good things were done. The beginning of change happened before the economy was stabilized. Believe it or not, it happened in the Collor government. And there are a lot of little stories about this, but it was the beginning of connecting Brazil with the world, and also the beginning of privatization that I believe has been a huge success. We can talk about that if you want. We had the Real plan that finally stabilized, got rid of hyperinflation. The Real plan, in reality, was something that had to be worked on for a few years. I was involved towards the end of the process, but once inflation disappeared, a lot of problems that weren't easily visible materialized. Our banking system was a bit of an inflation parasite. So we had massive bankruptcies. We had a budgetary crisis also because the government was managing the budget by withholding funds for a week, 2 weeks, a month. If you have 20% inflation a month, and some bureaucrat takes a month to put the money in your account in the Ministry of Education, you got 20% less. So that was that. And then we ended up with some balance and payments problems. And then I actually came when we did a sort of put in place the system that was there until recently, that had a inflation targeting, a floating exchange rate, and fiscal discipline. The fiscal discipline at the moment is no longer there. But that's no need to get into that very much. Then, through these years, and this we're talking now Cardoso and Lula for the most part, there was tremendous success in lowering extreme poverty with one very famous program that is the Bolsa Familia, that had been put in place on a trial basis in Brasilia and then by the Cardoso government. Worked out very well. Most kids attending school, but with not, enough of an education. Impressive health wins. If you ever look at the stats in Brazil of tobacco use, smoking, they are unbelievably good, possibly the best in any large country. Vaccination, thankfully we had people who had a culture of vaccination. When the previous president was campaigning against vaccination, the people said, to hell with you, I want to get my shot. Infant mortality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So quite a lot. A little bit of growth, as we have seen. But my thought at the time actually was that we're going to make it. I thought Brazil was done. One reason was that many people thought that Lula would destroy the economy. And this was an assumption that had sound support in the documents of the Workers' Party. If they did everything they promised they would do, it would have been a disaster. But Lula smartly ripped off the PT's program and threw it out and did quite well. And then I actually thought, this is it. Now we got it. And it was not to be, but it was fun while it lasted. I thought at the time that something that I believe is necessary, and I'm in the presence here of very, very famous and qualified political scientists, but I kind of think things work well when you have a short pendulum. You move a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right. It tends to work pretty well. And we had it, I thought. Cardoso, who was always center-left, he governed with a coalition that was sort of center-right. Compromises were made, worked pretty well. Lula did the same. So I said, we got it. But anyway, it was not to be. And here is the why don't we learn kind of thing again. We're appearing here for the first time in a very, very visible way. And here's what happened. In comes, out goes Dr. Palocci, the finance minister, who turned out to be extraordinarily competent. He had other issues that ended up being not so good, but he was a good finance economy minister. But then he had to leave. He did a bunch of stupid things and lost his job. He was already under pressure, and in comes Dilma Rousseff, still in the Lula era, and they kind of changed direction, and the direction was the same, the one that blew up. Pretty much exactly the same. This was a fatal attraction, if you will, not of course of the authoritarian military regime, but of the dirigist model that worked for a while under President Geisel in particular, with these national plans, economic plans, and so on and so forth. We had, during this period, the introduction of astoundingly large tax breaks and subsidies that made no sense whatsoever, neither in terms of inequality, because they were pretty much subsidizing the rich, nor of productivity, because these were very, very clear factors in sort of the misallocation of capital in Brazil. I'll show you some numbers. We were back to massive presence of the state in banking as well, and also typically lending on subsidized terms, and also based on relationships, call it. And then finally, under Dilma, a massive collapse in fiscal discipline that really blew up everything. She also was very unlucky. I think in the interest of being fair, she also was terribly unlucky with commodity prices, whereas Lula had 8 years of a commodity boom. She had 8 years of commodity prices falling. But she really blew up, and it was a very, very sharp recession. And here are some numbers for you to see. On the left, you have the fiscal collapse. On the right, real interest rates in Brazil have been and still are very high. Nobody questions this, but the question is really what to do about it, right? This is the chart on subsidies. This is done by the Treasury. The Treasury is not. We don't call Treasury what it is called here. The Treasury here is a ministry, but the Secretary of Treasury does this number, and in this case, I think also the tax authority. And if you look at this here, this number at the peak, 6.7% of GDP in subsidies. The line in black are subsidies provided by the National Development Bank that became super giant bank with funding directly from the treasury. And you can see that, you know, what used to be 3% of GDP towards the end of the Cardoso era more than doubled. Just to give you a sense of size, the Bolsa Familia program costs half a point of GDP. So a colleague of ours, Gustavo Franco, Harvard Ph.D., called it the Bolsa Empresário. It's a lovely phrase. Since then, quite a bit has been done, particularly with the National Development Bank. I don't have it here, but it's interesting that the National Development Bank was taken out of the picture, but capital markets filled the gap. More than 100%. It's fabulous what ended up happening. On the right, I have the proportion of assets under public in the books of public banks. And so it's just, you can see, it's over, for a while it was over 50%. This is an example. Now, then she was impeached. You can argue about her impeachment. I'm not going to do that. It was complicated, without a doubt. But anyway, she was impeached, and at that point, another kind of reform after was put in place. And quite a few items are worth mentioning. The BNDES, you saw the numbers. Basically, the BNDES is the National Development Bank, was lending at very low rates with, again, two companies that had access to market rates, and it really didn't make much sense, and they pretty much fixed that. A Social Security reform was done in, I think, in the end of the maybe I think it was in the beginning of the Bolsonaro government. Was prepared before. I actually was part of a group that put together the proposal that ended up getting done. There was a one that had been destroyed in Congress. This one came in and was, about 2/3 of it was done. We're already in need of another one. They put on a fiscal rule that was super tight, which was basically a ceiling on the growth in government expenditures in real terms. I, at the time, thought that was too tight because it would imply a massive reduction in the size of the state that I think was neither feasible nor desirable at that point, at that speed. But that's my view. But they put it in place, and it had the impact. Labor laws were changed, modernized. There was a very interesting law that regulates, still in place. It's about the governance of SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And last but not least, you probably know that Brazil has probably 50% of the homes in Brazil don't have clean water and sewage, and it's a disgrace. They put this in place. There were issues about who had the right to privatize or to sell the concession. There was a legal battle between the cities and the state governments, and they finally fixed that, and boom, the money, investments are flowing in. It's a very easy sector to privatize, very simple. If you read this classic paper by Andrei Schleifer from the economics department here, you see sanitation, you have to do three things. You have to provide clean water, trivial to monitor. You have to remove the sewage, and you have to treat it. Really easy to do. So it's a no-brainer to privatize. Read the papers in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, 1997, I think. It's a little jewel. And things actually started to work. Investments started to go up a little bit. But then Temer, he blew himself up. And I won't go into that. In came Bolsonaro. Some of these reforms were done in the Bolsonaro government, to be fair. No comments on so many other things. But that's that. Then now here we are, and we have a new president, and much to my surprise, we are seeing in the economic sphere another kind of flirt with old ideas that have failed us miserably. And what do I mean? I mean the following. Every single item here is being questioned. Every single one. There seems to be a desire to beef up the BNDES again, talking about Social Security reform, but it's really an unreformed. I think Lula shot that one down quickly, thankfully. But they were talking about that, the minister. The expenditure ceiling had already been blown out of the water by Bolsonaro in many aspects. Labor laws also being questioned. Nothing against seeing, okay, they've been in place for whatever, 8 years. Okay, let's see what's going on. That, I think, is fine and necessary. The SOE is the same thing. The SOEs have always been, offered a steady supply of jobs, cozy jobs, and they wanted to change. They apparently want to change that, and also the sanitation framework, plus proposals to play around with Petrobras again. There's this notion that because Brazil is a producer of oil, we shouldn't price oil derivatives at the market price, but they should sell it cheap, kind of a Venezuelan approach. Central bank independence and fiscal responsibility have been violently criticized by President Lula in a way that I think is terribly counterproductive. And then, as I mentioned, all the above. I think things are calming down a bit as we speak. But I just don't know where we're going to go. I don't know what is the development strategy that will be put in place, if any. I haven't lost hope. There is this discussion about the new fiscal rule. They've presented something I think is a step in the right direction, not enough, but if you know how these things work, a step in the right direction is nothing to sniff at. But we do have some problems. Now, what do I see are some challenges that are well known by scholars and so on, but less obvious. One is kind of legal uncertainty, and I misspelled that one over there. But we've had 128 constitutional amendments in 88, 12, 20, 35 years. The US has had 30-something. We do zero policy evaluation, almost. Don't want to be completely unfair with this exaggeration, but it's like very little would be the appropriate phrase. Policy evaluation. No wonder you have state capture, and we got to do something about that. A pet project of mine is the area of HR in government. I was very surprised at one point when I realized that China has a department that follows kind of careers and so on. Of course, it's a different system. First you have to be loyal, but then once you make that step, it's very unlikely that you get a promotion if you blow up on a given task over there. In Brazil, we've had all kinds of things, but the bottom line is there's no human resource management. Our budget procedures are nuts. There's no transparency. There's really no planning. This is an interesting point to dwell on the word planning. Sometimes people think planning means, old Soviet planning, Soviet style. People who don't plan are just messed up. There's nothing ideological. So, very little. The budget itself is something that is badly in need of not only of evaluation procedures, but also of a strategic view of where you want public money to go. It's just not done. All right, some challenges. Here is an example of something that I didn't include in my list just because I want to show you something. About 50% of the labor force in Brazil is either unemployed, a little bit less now, it's coming down, or in the informal sector. This is a really serious problem. Okay, we have that. Here, I'm going to skip. This is just the Human Development Index. I don't want to. I almost dropped this one. Basically, what it shows is as follows. Brazil is the dark line, and the US is here, and they're both improving. So there's some improvement, I could say. I mentioned the public health, kids in school, low inflation. So there are things to show. But you can see that we're moving slowly. That's what I wanted to show you here. You know this, but just so to remind you, there's Korea going fast, Chile going pretty fast. I guess India turning up now, etc. All right, now, some other things. I recently had a conversation, a very famous British journalist, and he called me to ask something. I forget what it was, but I managed to squeeze in my own question. And I asked him, when you hear the word Brazil, what do you think of? And he instantly said, the Amazon. And it was not in a flattering way, you can be sure of that. And then, so what else? He said, your democracy. What's going on with your democracy? Fast. And then I said, one more. And it took him 2 seconds. And he said, how come we don't grow more? So exactly the thing. So we've had, the numbers were a little better, but they don't seem to be doing that well yet. Hasn't been enough time to undo the crazy policies that we had in place. Those were totally, it's totally absurd. And it's an embarrassment. All right, now the end result is a little chart that I want you to get back, and I don't think I have any of this kind of chart. But I did a slightly different calculation. With all these problems, there are serious productivity issues in Brazil. I see this as an opportunity, quite frankly. Really, a gigantic opportunity. But the numbers are awful. This is the same chart using my my new time breakdown of GDP per worker. Okay? And look at what happened. For a while, we were doing what you would expect. People are studying. They're using machines. They're using better methods. And we were growing faster than the US. Look at this. This really, keep this one in your mind. This is a tragedy. Okay, it's not just that we're growing, because it's the growth per worker, and you could even do it per hours worked. I didn't have the number. Shows something that we're very sick. Okay, this is a real problem. It is, of course, I think, an equally important opportunity. But then we get to my next section, the one on deeper causes. And here I really apologize. I'm speaking before social scientists of the highest caliber, and I'm going to be very speculative. And you will see I don't have any silver bullets or anything. All right, please. But anyway, maybe you guys can think of something. So deeper causes. Now, what do we think? Okay, here's stuff that I want you to read. I didn't do this right, okay? This is a part of a newspaper piece by Essa de Queiroz, Portugal's, one of the top 2 most famous writers, the other being Camões, the poet, and Essa. And please read it, or I can read it for you. The entire nation lives off the state. This is a very famous quote. The important thing is this. before you finish, 1871. So I'm not a big believer in the colonial roots of things. I know they're important, very important work done down at MIT or in here. But then I take you back to my question, why? Why so persistent? And basically what he's saying is the entire nation lives off the state. The three dots I have there, he lists the clergy, the government bureaucrats, everyone. And then he says, now as the state pays poorly and no one can free themselves, this is Google translation, okay, from its guardianship to go into industry or commerce, this situation is perpetuated from parents to children like a fatality. 1871. So that's my question. Why so persistent? I think it's got to do with stuff like this. I don't have a framework. I don't have an organized view. Little stories. And I think they, for the most part, make sense. What troubles me is I'm not sure what to do about it. What do you do if you have low social capital? If there's an issue of trust? The numbers, when you look at the numbers for trust for Brazil, different institutes do different calculations, estimates. Brazil doesn't rank very high. Right now, the U.S. ranks pretty low too, by the way. I'm kind of worried about that. I'm a dual citizen, by the way. My mother is American. Issues, so the role of the elites, but it seems that we're in this big, somewhat messed up power allocation, and I'm not sure what can be done. But I think we've had it for a long time. These are call it the Portuguese roots, if you will. I'm not going back further, because a friend of mine convinced I was going to use the following. We learned in middle school that the English came here to stay and they went to Brazil to extract. But a friend of mine said, no, you have to read Sokolov and Engel. This is all wrong. And so I just mentioned it to embarrass myself a little bit. Now, then, where do I think we stand? So I think first, you recall I mentioned this short pendulum that I think we kind of need. In order for that to happen, there needs to be a reasonable consensus about broad lines of development strategy. You have to educate your people. You have to have the rule of law. You need a social safety network. Fair enough. Maybe you can do some types of industrial policy if you respect sort of cost-benefit calculus and budgetary arithmetic. If you can do that, perhaps, but then you have to evaluate, which is not done. So I think we need that. There, I think you have room for ideology in a way. I want a larger state, perhaps, because I want to offer more A, B, C, D, or this is not working very well, I want to go the other way. But it doesn't go too far, right? I know it can go far even in the advanced economies. I looked up the other day, France spends over 50% of GDP, government in France. This is primary spending, doesn't include interest. And the US is about a third. So, okay, there's room for ideology, for culture, for history, and it can still work. Second is what I've already mentioned. We're having macroeconomic crisis, extraordinarily high interest rates, and so on. And we're looking at it. We're looking at it right now in the eye. I think we're in the danger zone, and I think we have to be careful. I mentioned no evaluation of policies, institutions, and here it comes the human resources as well. If you're going to evaluate something, some social program or ministry, you have to evaluate the people. This is a no-brainer, I think. There's none of that. capture of the state by elites and special interest groups, it seems we're locked up in this trap. What I don't understand for you, political scientists, is how come things don't change? People, have one vote per person. Why doesn't it change? And I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. And so low trust and so on and so forth. Now, a note on the capture of the state. The thing that is so bothersome, it is totally regressive. And I think if you look at Brazil, the issues of productivity have to do with the allocation of capital. And if you're allocating capital because you have some crazy tax system, that has to eat up on your pie, So it's very serious stuff. Is being discussed in Brazil. I think tax reform might get done, but in the end, I think it is. I think a basic observation, as far as I can tell, no country has ever fully developed without a well-functioning state. It can be fairly large, like in Scandinavia or France, or historically small here. And it may have cultural roots, and each society kind of deals with its own preferences and history, but it has to be done pretty well. And I use this loosely, but I mean, transparent, accountable, efficient, and so on. Now, help needed from you guys. I think I have a little bit of time. Here's the thing. We have 31 parties. There are 21 in Congress. They are beginning to bundle up. That's probably good. We have a large fat tails. We have fat tails. We have a PT plus satellites tail, and Lula is making a major effort to go left, which I can't for the life of me understand. And then you got the right now very clearly. We didn't really know we had in us the Bolsonaro types. I didn't think we had it. Anyway, but what do I know? And this complicates things, because then you have this center that has about half, that has all kinds of things in it, but I think it is in the end it's a conservative bunch if you think not in terms of philosophical conservatism, Edmund Burke, but of sort of pragmatic conservatism, conserving your power, conserving your money, that kind of thing. And they're there, and then how do you, from this group, find a leader to jump into the ring with either of the two center? Lula is probably still center-left, okay, to be fair, or the more extreme right, to do something that I think would be more productive. So and so far we have this situation where the president has come recently from the extremes, but then they have to work with this center. It was done by Cardoso, it was done by Lula, but different party configuration, different circumstances. So anyway, I'm always surprised in our Congress how matters get vetoed by tiny groups on another issue. Anyway, that's kind of what I see. Now, is there a cure? And this is going to be a total disappointment, because I think I'm between no and maybe. Okay. In the short term, very difficult. Could it happen? It could. It could. But we're in kind of not miracle, but we need a little bit of luck, right? It might happen because the extremes are not doing well. Neither. The PT had a lot of problems after Lula's first term, and Bolsonaro the same. So there is maybe now the view, this was the vision of former Senator, former Governor Tasso Gereissati, he's just retired from the Senate, he's a terrific politician. So I have a few things that maybe might help a little bit, but I don't know. I don't know. My answer is I don't know. And this is to finish. I don't see a silver bullet because you see what I have there. This stuff is this is difficult to change, but I can't rule it out. I'm a big advocate of, at a minimum, working hard on making cost and benefits, and then who wins and who loses visible. I think this is really important. If you pound on this, like for instance, take our tax system. Talking about Claudio and I were talking about this yesterday at Let's. This is an embarrassment for people like us. I think we are liberals in the classic use of the word, but also in the social use of the word. And I'm glad he's nodding. I mean, we have the special tax regime, and it applies to professionals, but it has a special rule for lawyers. They pay 5% of their revenues, but now their businesses virtually have no expenses, so they probably pay 10% effective taxes, up to $1 million a year. It can't be the case. So I think this would be an important step. I think we ought to start doing spending reviews. The current minister is talking about that. I think is very good and very important. Will have long-term consequences. I'm big on the reform stuff that falls under the roof of reform of the state, the HR stuff, human resources for sure, spending reviews. If you're in business, people will talk about a zero-based budget. That might be a little bit extreme, but I kind of like the concept. We should be rethinking things. I believe the fiscal adjustment that has to take place in Brazil goes way beyond the number needed for debt sustainability. I think we could redirect a lot of expenditures. I have somewhere here, but I won't show it, but in Brazil, close to 80% of government spending goes to payroll and Social Security. This is a total outlier. I challenge you to look it up. It's probably 78% now. It's a complete outlier. Be careful, there are a few countries that have privatized their Social Security, so it's a different risk-sharing arrangement, but there are not too many. And I think we should do those for now, and hope that the consolidation in the party system leads into something. That's what I have. I hope I haven't been too long or too pessimistic, but that's how I see it. Thank you. Ele levou meu... Hã? Acho que ele levou meu... Vou sentar aqui ou lá?
Senta aí. All right, thank you, Arminio. So before we go to the Q&A, and please start thinking about the questions, I would invite Claudio to make a few reflections on the lecture.
Okay, thank you, Marcia. First of all, let me say that I am deeply, very deeply grateful and honored for all that you have done, putting this lecture together and doing that with such a kind and friendly way. To my dear friend, Fran, who initiated this, and to all the people at Harvard, who supported it. So, thank you very, very much to all of you. And my special thanks to my dear friend Arminio, who he didn't mention, probably he doesn't even know. I mentioned to him once. He is my distant cousin from from my mother's side. His family, Leão, and the family of my mother's mother, Coimbra, came from Pernambuco, right? And they were cousins over there. So that's another link that we had, which honors me also a lot, say that I'm Arminio's cousin. And Arminio, thank you very much for giving this excellent lecture and being kind enough to come from Brazil to honor me. So I'm deeply, thankful to you and to all of you who are here for this conference, who have bothered to come. I just say, it's very Arminio and I practically don't, disagree in anything. I just like, to point out to something that, that wasn't mentioned in Arminio's curriculum, that Arminio, his contribution to the country through his participation in the central bank was enormous. He assumed the presence of the central bank in a very turbulent period in our economic history and steered it, putting a system of flexible exchange rates in place and working with other people to put so-called tripod of macroeconomic policies in place, which was flexible exchange rate, fiscal responsibility, and monetary targets at the central bank, which really laid the ground for a very successful first Lula mandate, which was wise enough to to have kept the same policies that were put before by Fernando Henrique Cardoso, and Arminio was fundamental, doing that. So the country owes a lot, to you, Arminio. So anyway, that's the problem. Is the first question he put. Why and how could you do about it? Because the diagnosis is perfect. Have all those problems, how to solve them. I am in kind of a difficult ground here at Harvard, in the presence of many political science and economists, and so on. My friend Ed here also came, but I think everything has to do with I think his graph that he put there. 10% of Brazilians control 43% of GDP of the income. If you think about Brazil and other Latin American countries in general, they have been very pleasant for people who have money. People have money to live there. They have access to good schools, good health system, space, prices which are not high, services, domestic services, and so on and so forth. So it's very hard, for them to accept change. And one data which was very interesting, during the whole old republic, less than 6% of the population voted. In the first election after the old republic, with Jânio Quadros in 1960, if I'm not wrong, 12% of the population voted, only 12%, because illiterates could not vote. There were many restrictions in voting, it was complicated, and so on and so forth. The first election, and since then, after the military regime, nowadays more than 100 million people vote, which is basically 50% of the population or more. So there was a huge difference. In order to be elected, nowadays people have to attract votes from this 50%, which is the bottom or the middle distribution. And then, the country is more prone to, populistic policy, number one, because it's generally a politician may promise simple and easy solutions, which are not simple nor easy anyway. And that creates those extremes of policy. That's number one. And second, in order to accept the changes that came as a result of this political environment, the elite put there in the budget many special treatments. So, the budget, as you see, 6% of Brazilian GDP are subsidies to special groups of interest. So they are there for a reason, and obviously nobody wants to evaluate any policy because evaluation and transparency doesn't attract anybody. And the budget, all the public policy, as Arminio pointed out, not only there's no evaluation. I mean, instead of focusing what is the objective of the government policy, the public policy. For instance, education is for a student to learn. Sewage is to give access to clean water and sanitation to the population. No, they keep talking about the inputs. I mean, what's going to happen at the schools? What's going to happen with the teachers? Let's put tablets in the school. Let's then the sewage. No, after all, there are state companies which need to be protected because they employ people and so on and so forth. I mean, the end result of the policy is not talked about, and of course, not never evaluated properly. So that really makes government policy extremely ineffective, Brazil spends a lot. It's not that lacks money. There is money, but the problem is how to spend it right. Well, I don't want to extend on that because we'll have now a discussion here, and I will let you guys who, maybe more, much more intelligent and so on than I am to talk about that now. So I just, say again that I am extremely happy, touched, and honored by this ceremony that you put together, the Haddad Lecture, and thank you again very, very much.
Huh? No, thank you. Okay, so now we have some time for the Q&A. We have questions. Okay. Do we have a microphone? Right here.
Thank you, Dr. Fraga, and all Harvard officers who made this possible. It's very special to be here. My name is Eduardo. I'm a second-year student at the college studying economics and government. I have two quick questions. The first one is, in a recent conversation with Diogo Guilhem, who is director at the central bank now, also holds a Ph.D. at Princeton, he was saying how his life is much harder because of the lack of coordination between fiscal and monetary policy in Brazil. Across administrations, it's very hard for fiscal and monetary policies to be coordinated. So my question is there any innovative institutional or legal arrangement for us to diminish friction between the executive and the central bank? And the quick follow-up to this question is, in an extremely unequal country like Brazil, what should be different in a central bank's mandate so that the social challenges of Brazil are addressed? Is inflation targeting and promoting employment sufficient enough, or there needs to be a social cause in the central bank's mandate for inequality to be addressed and for us to move towards a more just country? Thank you.
Sure. Look, the idea behind inflation targeting was exactly designed to answer your question. The target is chosen by the government, and the central bank is given the independence to pursue that target, not whatever they want. So in theory, if the central bank is having trouble, that's the case in Brazil, and rates are very high, I think what the central bank needs is help. And what help can the government do? They can try to balance the government's finances to put less pressure on the central bank so that the very high interest rates don't have to go even higher, threatening a debt spiral that could be very dangerous. I think I don't think there's any way around it. Now, second question, what was it again? No. I mean, look, in the U.S., you have, I think, a unique form that has often been discussed by other countries, but I think it is good economics to know that the central bank cannot provide growth. Growth comes from productivity, from education, from saving. However, the central bank can do a lot of harm, including for the poor people. And what we do know for sure is that the big losers, if you have inflation, are the poor, because they cannot protect their earnings. We know in Brazil from days past that people had to rush to the supermarket the day they got their paycheck. And I think that is for sure. You can do some smoothing of the business cycle, but that's about it. And I think in the Brazilian Congress was very careful when they mentioned the employment issues as a secondary target. Is not because they think employment is not important. It's because they understand that the way to get employment up and steady up is to have a macroeconomic environment that is conducive to long-term investing, to risk-taking, rather than the opposite. So I think, I don't think there is a solution. I think giving the central bank other mandates ends up being an impossible task. The central bank doesn't have the instruments. This should be done through political means, through the budget. One budget, then you pick your priorities and you get it done.
Michael? Oh, yeah, Fernanda and then Michael.
Thank you. Good evening. My name is Fernanda Simini. I'm here as a visiting scholar. And as a political sociologist, it was a relief to hear your call for bringing social sciences to the table. And as a social scientist, I look at those topics, and all that I see is about power, about balance of power and power redistribution. And how can we redistribute power without touching the economic structure? I would like to hear your view on that and maybe talk about progressive taxation. Is this feasible for Brazil? Thank you.
Yes, that's a great question. And look, the puzzling issue is that in a democracy you have so many loopholes and so many gimmicks that channel money to the rich or to the less poor in some cases. And I think the only cure is to have all this out in the open. I do not think this is a zero-sum game. I think it's very important. I find it important to mention every time, say, I talk about inequality, I tend to mention also inequality of opportunity. And I think once we figure that out, the answer should arise, but somehow it hasn't in Brazil. That's where I throw the ball over to you, figure it out. I mean, I don't know what's going on. Why we don't, why we keep, crossing the street to step on a banana peel that is on the other side of the road. All over and over. We should stop doing that. It's stupid.
Thank you, Arminio, for being here, and thank you, Claudio. I'm Michael Chu from the Harvard Business School. And when I look at the picture that you've presented, one of the questions is, what are the forces that may change, that may drive change? And as you know, being from the business school, I look at macroeconomics. And when I look at inequality of Brazil, it seems to me that there have been some changes that have come from sources that are not typically looked at for solutions. But when I look at Brazil and its inequality, I think of one, Soridens, for example, the largest dental clinic in Latin America that actually provides world-class dental attention to the majority of Brazilians, that 70% that lies between the well-served 25% at the top and the lower 10%, because of the failures of SUS. And in a sense, the failures that you point out create enormous opportunities. And what I find interesting is that the opportunities deal a lot with reaching the majority of the market, not the top or the bottom, which are oversaturated at one end. And the other example that is Brazilian that has struck me recently is, of course, there's been oligopoly in banking in Brazil. But a fissure in that has been the creation of Nubank, which was a response to all the inefficiencies and problems of the banking system. What is your perspective on that driver of change that business could be, especially in things like inequality?
Yeah, so I'm skeptical that we will solve this through business alone. I think the incentives have to be thought through. And we, again, end up thinking about the state and the political structure we have in place that doesn't channel the resources appropriately in the end. That's the way I see it. And I see this as being consistent with a growth strategy because we're talking about education, we're talking about health, and I'm talking about financing, not necessarily actually delivering the services. You can and should experiment with many different mechanisms, including privatization, public-private partnerships, etc. But I think in the end, that's what we need. In terms of the health system, the Constitution of Brazil, written after the end of military rule, 1988, it was promulgated, states we have free and universal health, a la the UK. In the UK, 80-90% of spending in health is public. In Brazil, the proportion of spending with public health is lower than here. It's like 45%. So there are issues of allocation, there are issues of management, lack of evaluation, and so on. All of the above. I'm very much in favor of experimenting with mechanisms for the provision of many of these services. I think they tend to work pretty well, but even that we haven't been able to study. We are, for instance, at IETS trying to get data to compare the privately managed public hospitals in a few different states in Brazil. And surprise, surprise, in the one state that seems to do poorly, that I'm very well acquainted with, my own, I can't get the data. They say, well, probably because it's not very good. In São Paulo, there is data, and they do a terrific job. So it's all, I think, in the way the system of incentives and evaluation and proper design are and how they must be improved in the end.
So there was a question here in the back, and then I'll go to you, Fernando.
Thank you, Arminio, for the brilliant presentation. It was a great recollection of why Brazil is in this situation. My name is Cristiano. I'm an MBA student from MIT. And I would like to hear your thoughts on Brazil's reindustrialization. Some people claim that this could be a path forward, but Brazil is also a country with very high import taxes and capital controls. So my question is, how could we reindustrialize Brazil into this 4.0 industrial revolution? And if these imports and taxation for imports and capital controls, do they help us or do they harm us? And if so, what's the ideal amount?
Yeah, I think your question kind of leads into the answer. I think it's impossible to have modern, efficient manufacturing without modern, efficient equipment, software, ideas, and so on. I think there's no hope of that. Manufacturing is probably not as bad as it looks if you include the agriculture sector, where there's a lot that goes way beyond just planting soybeans, but they are operating in an open, for the most part, an open environment, and they're not, some of the technology, the genetics, and so on is cutting edge, and they seem to be able to do it just with people, just importing people or having people like us getting an education here and going back. But where you need to import stuff, I think we're in trouble. But it's doable. We have the scale. Most major business are there for quote unquote strategic reasons. They're unlikely to leave. It's just up to us. We can do it. But remember, manufacturing, even in China, is a much smaller percentage of GDP than people think. I think it's less than 40% of GDP, and China seems to manufacture everything in the planet these days. So there's other stuff going on in services, and often it's even difficult to distinguish exactly what is what. These labels are somewhat old. But you have the answer in your question already. I'm talking too much.
Fernando has a question.
Thank you, Dr. Fraga. I'm Fernando Bizarro. I'm a political scientist here who studies why Brazilian parties are weak and who has written a paper on how strong political parties help promote economic growth. So I'm very pleased to see you saying things that are very aligned with my priors as well. And I'm curious, though, about the relationship between these ideas and the collapse in productivity, which I think many economists, and that's my perception, do realize is one of the greatest challenges of Brazil moving forward. And a lot of the political institutional causes that you highlighted have been associated with growth, but I have not seen them associated with productivity. And so I'm curious whether you think they also cause the low productivity and how, or if not, what else causes the low rates of productivity that we observe in Brazil?
I think you could decompose productivity, you basically accounting for the use of capital, for ideas and practices and so on the positive side, if you will, but then on issues that distort the allocation of resources. And there's excellent literature, quite a bit done here at MIT, at Stanford, Princeton, etc., that suggests it's all the above. Now, there's been a little bit of growth, it's just mediocre. So we should be able at some point to jump. But I think it would take a bold move towards kind of modernizing things. Education, I think, is the hardest. It's a very long-term investment, subject to political pressure as well, everywhere, positive and negative. So anyway, the other one is interesting. Sometimes we think of Brazil as a country isolated from the rest of the world. Now, I hate to break the news to you, but we are isolated from ourselves. And why do I say this? Our tax system is a mind-boggling mess. And to do business from one state to another, you have to have like an army of lawyers. And even then, sometimes there's no solution. You end up allocating capital where it doesn't belong. The free zone of Manaus is a good example, and it's very expensive. And also our infrastructure. Infrastructure should be boom town in Brazil. But with uncertainty in many aspects, there's underinvestment. So between the infrastructure and the distortions of our tax system, you have right there, I think, a space for growth. It's really for increasing the level of GDP, but during the time it's increasing, we're moving towards the frontier, which is good enough by me. And anyway, send me your papers.
You have a question? Yeah, right here.
Thank you. My name is Vinicius. I'm doing the Master in Public Administration International Development at the Kennedy School here. I have one question regarding the development strategy that you said that Brazil doesn't have for a long time. I'd like to listen to your perspective on some of the ways to build a development strategy. And one specific question I want to know, for example, in education, I see that civil society plays an important role in building consensus on what needs to be done to improve students' learning. For example, the role that Todos pela Educação, Fundação Lehman play in building consensus. Do you think when we talk about economic development, we also can think about ways civil society can help to build this consensus? To what degree you think it's possible, or it's necessary to have like, it depends more like on the president, on the leaders of government, and how do you think we can build this kind of consensus of what needs to be done for Brazil to grow more?
Yeah, I'm not thinking of a consensus that is absolute. There's one method. I think it's wonderful to have diversity, to have experimentation, and I think the not-for-profit sector in Brazil and in the world, in the field of education, done a tremendous job. And I do think it will pay off. It is paying off, but it is slow. It takes 13, 14 years to educate, take someone through college, and if they're going to go to grad school, like many of us have been lucky to be able to do even more. So it takes time, but it is happening. There's still issues. Bad ideas, old ideas, but that's fine. That's par for the course. And education is great. I decided to get involved in health policy because I felt we did not have in the field of health that I think is reasonable to argue is the second most importance, and it's big in terms of how much it spends. I didn't see it. So the reason, I and colleagues, a key advisor of ours is right here, partner, went into this was exactly the feeling that there was plenty to do, but there's more in other areas. So yeah, no, I think, and I think we're seeing, even though there's no tax incentive for not-for-profit stuff in Brazil, it is happening. It's beautiful, really. It is good. You take chances, you experiment, because it's harder. In governments, people tend to be risk-averse. They tend to feel there's no upside for them, but there is downside if they really blow it. Anyway.
What is amazing is that we don't take a drug or a vaccine or some interventions without a trial and results and an evaluation. So we know we can do it. But there are so many programs that we just implement and never evaluate, and somebody in the future will do exactly the same and make the same mistakes. So maybe, Vinicius, the way to go is to start asking those questions, because we're not going to learn if we don't ask the questions and get the answers. And a lot of the answers we just don't have, and you raised several of those. So we're going to break now. We have a reception, but thank you for being here. And above all, thank you, Claudio, for your friendship, your generosity, and for being here with us. So thank you all.